You are listening to the Visualising War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. Today's episode is part of a short mini-series looking at artistic interventions in conflict. We explored an incredible collection of conflict textiles last week, which drive home the terrible costs of violence in war. And today we're going to be turning our attention to the art of peace. My three guests, Teresa Ó Brádaigh Bean, Lydia Cole, and Azadeh Sobout, are all involved in a major research project led by Oliver Richmond, Stephanie Kappler, and Birte Vogel, based at the universities of Manchester and Durham. The project is exploring arts-based approaches to peacemaking and the role that grassroots-led art projects in particular can play in helping communities process and recover from conflict. Teresa is a research associate on the Art of Peace project, and she also works for the charity In Place of War, which supports artists and cultural organisations in places of conflict all around the world. Her recent work has focused particularly on creative enterprise, community arts education, and arts-based social movements in Colombia. And she's co-editor of a volume coming out soon called The Art of Making Something from Nothing, which looks at the social impact of arts projects across the global south. Lydia is a research associate on the Art of Peace project too, having previously worked at the University of St Andrews. She's closely connected to the Conflict Textiles project, which we talked about last week, and she's curated a range of exhibitions in connection with this, particularly bringing feminist international relations theory and critical peace and conflict studies together. She's passionate about creative and participatory approaches to peace and conflict studies, and her work for the Art of Peace project has focused particularly on grassroots art projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Last but not least, Azadeh is a research associate at the University of Manchester, leading a research project on the intersection of arts and peace building in Lebanon. She has a particular interest in post-war geographies and narratives of displacement, in how different affected communities present their histories and identities through different artistic media, and how different forms of art can create avenues for peace activism by helping people work through the complexities of solidarity, responsibility, and ethics. So all three of my guests today have very distinctive approaches to studying the art of peace, and they specialize in very different parts of the world. But they're united in their belief that the creative arts have huge potential in helping to establish lasting peace and also in achieving post-conflict justice for whole communities. So Lydia, Teresa, Azadeh, many thanks for taking time to talk with me today. We have lots to talk about, but first, let me just welcome you to the Visualising War podcast.
Hello. Hey.
So Teresa, I wonder if we can begin with you. For the last decade, as I said, you've worked for the charity In Place of War, which in some ways is a precursor to the Art of Peace research project. So can you just kick us off by telling us a bit about that charity, when it was founded, why it was founded, and what kind of work it does?
So In Place of War originally kind of emerged from the University of Manchester. It started as a research project led by Professor James Thompson. And the research question really was that in times of war, do people make art, and why would they? And this, of course, led to a whole mapping exercise across different conflict zones, so Sri Lanka, DRC Congo, Kosovo. And of course, they found lots and lots of examples of kind of community responses, creative responses to conflict. So sometimes art was being made in spite of the conflict, art was being made because of the conflict. And so from there, we kind of developed a network of artists. And I guess we departed really from being more academic research based to then asking the question of, well, how can we support, how can we be useful to these grassroots artists? How can we amplify their work? How can we support their work and sustain their work? And so we now have become a charity both in the UK and also in the USA. And we support this network of artists who are normally rooted in the communities in which they serve. So they're very, very grassroots. They may not even be formal NGOs, and they may just literally be a collective who, you know, they don't have a formal space, very, very grassroots. And we support them through the creation of cultural spaces. This could be offering equipment, leveraging our networks, both within kind of the music industry or the kind of creative industries. So through kind of offering equipment and training in the use of equipment. It can also be through training, so things like education. So this is essentially knowledge exchanges that have been formalized into structured programs that have been certified by the University of Manchester. So this is about, I guess, decolonizing knowledge, celebrating local knowledge production, but enabling it to be exchanged between communities that perhaps wouldn't have the opportunity to interact. And then we also provide platforms for artists to tell their stories. For example, on this project, we've produced a documentary. We also release music. We enable cultural producers or creatives to come together to exchange ideas. So you'll see examples of cultural spaces in Zimbabwe that have been inspired by cultural spaces in Venezuela because they've interacted through the In Place of War network. That's kind of what we do in a nutshell.
Wow, thank you. So lots of facilitation of artwork that is perhaps already going on the ground in all sorts of different communities, different kinds of artwork, but really bringing people together and supporting and fostering that as a way of partly surviving conflict, but also actually, I think your motto is creativity conquers conflict. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's about the power of the art in reimagining not only the future, but also the present, and kind of, again, bringing in things around memory. So memory being something that we can use, and having that kind of visual idea of memory as a way of building tomorrow and building a future. And I think it's really important to stress that we don't intervene. So we don't kind of parachute in, maybe in a kind of traditional NGO sense, like, oh, you people have been traumatized by war, let's do some art therapy. We don't do any of that. We understand that the local communities themselves are best placed to understand their context and their reality. And it's about how we can support existing work on the ground rather than trying to kind of intervene and impose projects on people.
Absolutely. And is this NGO actually relatively unusual in the work that it does? Are there other organizations out there that do anything similar?
I think there are organizations that do similar things, but perhaps not so consistently. So you might have examples of international NGOs that work in peace building, and they may kind of dip their toe in, should we say, and have certain elements of arts-based approaches. But I don't think we kind of straddle, and this is why we're quite difficult to classify, because we're not a traditional international development agency, but then we're not just an arts charity where, you know, we're offering kind of music scholarships. So it's that kind of intersection between kind of driving community development or supporting community development through the arts, and that being driven by the people on the ground who've chosen a creative path to facilitate development or to try and build peace in their communities.
And it's really interesting to hear that In Place of War as a charity actually emerged from a research project, which isn't a typical route actually for charities to take. Lydia, I think this might be a good moment to come to you, because the Art of Peace Research Project was founded actually just a couple of years ago by a cluster of IR scholars who were inspired by In Place of War and other work in the same area. So I wonder if you can just give us a quick overview of what this new research project, also based at the University of Manchester, is seeking to do.
Yeah, sure. So my role on the project is to work specifically on the Bosnia case study and kind of artists in Bosnia. But the project as a whole looks at 4 different contexts. So alongside Bosnia, we also have research going on in Colombia, as Teresa's already mentioned, Lebanon and DRC Congo as well. So my understanding of the project really is that we're looking at these different kinds of grassroots arts, and really anything from hip hop to theatre, sound art, street art, a whole range of different kinds of forms of engagement, really. Looking at, I guess, what the intentions of artists are and how the artists are trying to communicate messages of peace. In Bosnia, we talk more about conceptions of social justice, and I guess trying to see what the artists are trying to communicate through their arts. I think this contrasts, and the aim of the project is really to contrast to more traditional forms of peace building and peace building narratives about how art works and how art can contribute to building peace. So as Teresa kind of mentioned, art has been incorporated in forms of kind of liberal peace building through group therapy, healing from trauma, these kinds of things. And I think this is quite a narrow conception of what art does in spaces of conflict. So what we're trying to do with the project is to broaden this out and kind of, I guess, question this narrow understanding and see what else art can do.
That's really fascinating. So more traditional approaches have a relatively narrow conception of the role that art can play. But because you've been observing what artists actually on the ground are doing in Lebanon and the DRC and so on, you're uncovering a wider range of things that different forms of art, activism and so on can do in terms of peace building, but also transitional justice. I wonder if you can say a bit more about what you've been uncovering. What beyond therapy, for example, or trauma processing, have you been finding that people are using art to do post-conflict?
I guess one thing that marks the Art of Peace out from other projects that look at the role of art in peace building is that we actually support different grassroots artists to create artwork. So in the case study that I'm working on in Bosnia, we've been working with OKC Abrašević, which is a youth cultural centre in Mostar, to create a sound archive of the city. So the sound archive tells different stories through narrative, but also kind of found sounds and kind of readings, interviews, lots of different, sounds put together, I guess, to create an overall kind of alternative archive of what art does in the city. And I think one of the things that I've found across the different cases of kind of arts projects that I've been looking into is really that the arts are kind of trying to curate different kinds of community in different contexts. So I guess what I mean by this is that the art itself becomes kind of a glue for both artists and communities. So through the sound art, not only is the artist kind of talking to different creators in Mostar, but it's also imagined that the sound art will be used as a basis for guided tours around the city. So kind of drawing other people into the stories of art and kind of creating community through that.
That's really fascinating. So the research aspect of the project is observing, is looking, is noticing all the different things that art can do. And in the process, really actually stretching our understanding of different forms of art and their potential, but also then actually really stretching our understanding of peace building and what goes into peace building, and essentially not a top-down approach, not lots of people coming to deliver peace, but the way in which communities themselves actually find ways to connect and rebuild from the ground up. Azadeh, can we bring you in here, I wonder, to tell us a bit more about the kinds of peace and the kinds of conflict which the Art of Peace project wrestles with? I saw on the project website quite an intriguing sentence. It says, far from romanticizing peace, the project draws on the importance of problematizing and conceptualizing the meaning of peace. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about that.
First of all, thank you for having me as part of this panel. To respond to your question, I would like to take a step back and elaborate the context I'm working in. In this project, I focus on the creative space that emerged from the Syrian uprising in Lebanon. The Syrian revolution led to a surge of spontaneous and organized forms of intellectual and artistic expressions. In particular, the arrival of artists from Syria transformed the art scene in Lebanon. During the past 2.5 years, I have conducted over 70 interviews with independent artists, creative professionals, in addition to some government-funded organizations on the intersection of arts and peace building. What these interviews depict is that the dominant Western terminology of peace and conflict does not often resonate with the experience of people in the region, and the use of this conceptualization sometimes proves to be contentious. For me, the idea has been to rethink a conceptualization that is rooted in how diverse communities affected by the war in Syria visualize peace. Now let me give you a snapshot of these diverse communities. The Syrian displaced population in Lebanon exceeds 1.5 million today. The conflict in Syria has also forced many Palestinian refugees previously living in Syria to flee to Lebanon in search of safety. Lebanon currently hosts at least 480,000 Palestinian refugees, most of whom have been displaced more than once in their lifetime. In the same context, the legacy of Lebanese civil war and Israeli military invasions continues to sustain the internal displacement of many Lebanese communities from South and Mount Lebanon. Most of these internally displaced people have found home in proximity to refugee camps in Beirut. So you have a context where internally Lebanese live side by other refugee communities coming from outside Syria. Furthermore, the recent displacement of Armenians from Syria to Lebanon, Armenians who had found refuge in Syria after the genocide in Turkey, they are now being displaced once again, and they are finding place in countries like Lebanon. So when you look at the art scene in Beirut in particular, you see how this perpetual state of displacement experienced by these many communities is being reflected and reproduced in the creative collaboration between artists who cross their path in Beirut. Now going back to your question and why it is important not to romanticize peace. How we visualize peace has an impact on what kinds of peace we succeed in building. And our conception of peace are obviously bound up with our experience of war. When we talk about Syria, the war is not experienced the same all over the country. And for those who have been displaced and living outside, the experience of exile has created different personal and political dynamics. Therefore, we need to shift our understanding to micropolitics and politics from below in order to understand the complicated multi-layer experience of war on different communities. I give you one example. I would point the vital role that the Palestinian artists have played in documenting the devastating effect of war on Syria's Palestinian refugee population. These artistic initiatives have moved away from the binary of peace and conflict in an attempt to open a space of resistance and critical imagination. We have the work of Salim Asi, a Palestinian artist whose arts bear witness to tragic history of Palestinian displacement while highlighting the perpetual cycle of violence and rightlessness. Challenging the concept of art for peace, Asi asserts, I don't make art for peace or for building bridges. As a Palestinian artist, I can say it in another way. Give me my rights first, and then I will lead the peace across the world. Artists are challenging this very top-down and colonial definition of peace, which comes with reinforcing the status quo, the injustice, and rightlessness. What they are doing is visualizing resistance against this very imposed definition of peace.
That's so fascinating, Azadeh. Thank you. I mean, it really chimes with some of what Lydia was saying, and indeed Teresa, about the importance of observing what's going on and then supporting and facilitating grassroots art and activism as an alternative to the kind of peace building that I suppose many of us in the West in particular imagine is sort of delivered from on high. But as you say, it's disrupting this kind of top-down colonial definition of peacemaking and really revisualizing it as an act of resistance, as something about actually claiming rights, claiming human rights, that phrase critical imagination as well. It's amazing to hear about these disruption of this sort of binary opposition between peace and conflict as well. And you've just given us a really good overview of why it's important to look at the micropolitics and this perpetual displacement and the diverse experiences that people have of it. We'll come back to what you've been doing in Lebanon in a bit. But Lydia, I wonder if we can come back to you just to start diving deeper into some of the specific projects that you've been working on as well. So as you said earlier, you've been particularly looking at arts-based peace building in Bosnia. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what specifically you've been looking at there. So you mentioned sound art and a street art festival in Mostar, for example. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what you've been looking at and what you've been unearthing.
Yeah, sure. So I think what Azadeh was saying about there being different experiences of conflict in different spaces is also really significant in Bosnia. Primarily, I've conducted work both in Sarajevo and Mostar, cities which have quite different experiences of war, and also experiences of war over time that also influence kind of the way that art is made and kind of the reference points of art as well. So in Sarajevo in the 1990s, the city came under siege by Bosnian Serb forces, and this is kind of one of the longest sieges in modern history. Mostar had a slightly different experience of conflict in that the city was under siege in 1992, but through the combined efforts of the war coalition in Mostar, Bosnian Serb forces were actually driven out. What followed after this was a conflict between the Bosnian army on the one hand and the Croatian forces on the other hand. And this is something that really, in the post-war period, caused a lot of division, both in terms of the political situation, but also in terms of the territorial division of the city. So in terms of my research in Sarajevo, so I've been looking at an example of artivism, which feeds into a wider activist mobilization around a specific site of memory. This is a site of memory that was opened in the late 80s as a commemoration to the Second World War. So it's a monument complex which commemorates the fallen partisan soldiers and also civilians from the Second World War. So this is then an interesting memorial site in contemporary Bosnia, precisely because it's also a monument of the socialist period. So when we think of Bosnia, it's important to always think of it as undergoing several transitions. This transition from socialism, kind of transition from war to peace. And I think what comes with this is also a kind of wider transition to neoliberalism as well. So what the activists are responding to in the case of Vratsa Memorial Park, the site of memory, is the government's failure to address the necessary restorations to the site that were necessary after its destruction during the 1990s siege. One of the points of activists was then to clear and clean the monument. Then more recently, one of the elements to the site, a monument called Jenny Borac, which means woman fighter, her right arm was destroyed. So this was quite significant to activists within Sarajevo because the right arm is the symbol of resistance and power within anti-fascist discourses of the socialist period. So what artivists did in this case was to create a scaffold-like arm and affix it to the arm of the statue. And they took some pictures and then they had to remove it because to leave it would be kind of interpreted as vandalism of the monument. In this case, art is really being used to provoke political action and to try and get officials to engage with their continuing failure to restore elements of the site. In this sense, I'm not really sure of kind of the success of this as an artistic intervention. It certainly drew attention to the site, and I think it also collected activist and artistic communities at the site. It rendered the site as a space where art was possible. And this is seen in theatre productions and other various artistic actions that happened at the site afterward. But when I spoke to government officials, they weren't really aware of this as an action. And today the monument is still not repaired. But this is also a symbol that recurs in other artistic interventions. So there's an artist called Smirna Kalinovic who did an action at the site in 2019 entitled Sentence Me to Death. So she recurates the monument and the kind of missing arm through creating the posture of the statue and writing the word Nishta on her right wrist, meaning nothing, sort of to draw attention again to the missing arm. So I think this is a really interesting case because unlike a lot of arts in Bosnia, this is happening without funding. It's really coming from the grassroots and used for activist purpose. But I think also in this case, it's very difficult to assess, I guess, the success of the intervention. I think, there's a kind of interesting thing that happens around the creation of community, but again, this official silence on the action is quite deafening.
So Lydia, that's a really fascinating description there of very non-traditional forms of art, of artivism, where memory is at stake, but really interestingly, the art actually is a very transitory act and something that perhaps doesn't necessarily imprint itself on the memory of the political people it's aimed at, perhaps. I suppose one of the things that it does is just remind us how many different forms art can take, but also the sort of the connection between art and resistance, art and politics, which I think Azadeh was hinting at a little bit when she was talking earlier. Lydia, you've talked about this sort of site of memory as an important place for a kind of succession of artistic interventions, but you'd also mentioned some art activism or artivism in Mostar as well. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
So one of the sound stories in the sound archive created by Ronald Panzer, the artist who works in the case of Brashevich, is actually of the Partisan Memorial Cemetery in Mostar. This is an earlier example of a monument complex which also commemorates the fallen partisans from the Second World War. I think one of the things that Ronald was trying to, communicate through his sound story was that the Partisan Memorial Cemetery was in the past a space of art, in the sense that its creation had rhythms of art through the working. So the workers kind of sang songs while they were working, and people from the city visited the site. So there's this sense of nostalgia for the art of the past within the sound story. But it also connects to the Mostar of the present, where the cemetery has been the site of different artistic interventions at different periods of time. In the sound story, what he's trying to draw together is these two visions of Mostar, the Mostar of the past and the Mostar of the present, and to suggest that these cities are part of the same city. And I think why that's important is that the Mostar of the past is so different from the Mostar of today. Many things have changed in Mostar. People have been displaced, new people have moved in. Many people who've moved to Mostar don't remember the Mostar of the past. So this artistic recording and the commemoration of art and its connection to the future is what's significant about the story.
Again, really fascinating. So another art form, the use of sound, historic sounds, contemporary sounds, brought together, blended, and using listening as a way of visualizing, a way of looking back into the past, looking at the present, looking into the future. And again, just really showing us the way in which art opens up conversations. And they might be quite combative conversations, like around the memorial space that you were talking about earlier, where artists are really actually trying to kind of provoke the political classes and get them to think about their responsibility or their failure in some ways to commemorate, or combative conversations where there's an alternative viewpoint being put across, but also actually more collaborative or cooperative dialogue being established by just bringing past and present and future into the same space and getting people to listen. Listening in itself is an incredibly powerful tool for promoting reflection. Azadeh, can we come back to you? Because one or two of the things that Lydia has talked about raise questions for me about your work as well. So one thing I'd like to ask about is your interest in memory itself. I think some of the work that you've been doing and the art that you've been looking at in the Lebanon is really very much about memories that people try to collate and bring together, and memoryscapes. Is that right?
Yes, one of the aspects of the artistic creation in the Lebanese context that I work in is engaging with art as a sort of discourse production. And what I call memoryscape, I particularly like this phrase because it combines the spatial element of remembering with the mental space of remembering. As if you're talking about the landscape, you have a memoryscape. So what the artists have done, because of the amount of destruction which has undergone in Syria, in different communities, you have the artists who have highlighted the production of counter-narratives and alternative models as the central contribution of their art. For example, you have the works of Dima Nashavi, a Syrian illustrator, who has dedicated some of her illustrations to different cities of Syria, and bringing the elements and symbolism of different cities and how different cities were engaged in Syrian revolution and the fate of each city in the revolution and the memories untold, and how the interaction between the memory making and reviving the space is not just for the sake of truth telling and documenting, but also having an outlook for the future reconstruction of those cities. Because eventually the artists look at themselves as visionaries, as people who are connecting the memories of the past to the future reconstruction of Syria. And these memoryscapes are map for the future, the map of dreams, aspirations, desires, and the way of continuing the history.
So again, art that looks back to the past, but as a way of looking to the future, but visualizing the future, not just by looking, but actually trying to generate it, trying to build it, foster it. And I suppose that gets me thinking about another question, Azadeh, which is about who are the artists you've been working with in refugee communities in Lebanon actually trying to communicate with? Is this art that's being created for, fellow Syrians, or for, all sorts of different communities within Lebanon? Is it art that's being created actually for a more international community? Who are they trying to speak to?
When we look at the formation of these artistic collectives in Lebanon, we notice that for many artists, these collectives have brought an opportunity to be connected to the Syrian revolution in exile. In particular, when I'm talking about this, I mean about the displaced communities, the displaced artists who moved to Lebanon. Many of these artists refer to their artistic engagement as part of the wider revolution discourse. And I would like to emphasize this because I've noticed that sometimes as social scientists, we have the tendency of looking at art as a tool of peace building. But what we need to really see is how artists are approaching arts, not as a tool of peace building, not as a tool of social change, but they see it as part of the wider revolution discourse. Abdullah Al-Kafri, an award-winning playwright, theater director, and cultural activist based in Beirut, he asserts that art can create space for the voices of the revolution, the voices of ordinary people who tell their stories. Milad Amin, the Syrian artist and filmmaker, describes the role of artists as revolutionary, the one who disrupts the status quo and reclaims transformation through acts of reimagining, remaking, resisting, and critiquing. Again, I go back to Dima Nashavi, the illustrator and artist I referred earlier. She discusses about different ways of being revolutionary and refers to the capacity of arts in redefining social relations. In her view, the act of redefining, the act of recreating in itself is a revolutionary practice. So by mentioning this, first of all, I wanted to take you to the level of engagement of artists, Syrian artists and artists displaced from Syria, including Kurds, Armenians, and Palestinians. But also what we have in Lebanon, where you find a microcosm of Syrian community in these artistic scenes, you see that none of these artists actually reclaim the existence of their art as pure artistic creation, rather an activism and a revolutionary practice. Some of these artists also call themselves artivists, which was mentioned earlier by our colleague Lydia. Artivist means, as they define themselves, they combine art with activism. Artistic creation in this context, therefore, can be seen as an attempt for community building from below. And the work of these artists could be understood as a conscious effort in creating a common space for these diverse communities as they come together toward recreating the future, not of the Syria alone, but of the wider region. As I mentioned, there are diverse communities interconnected in their histories of struggle and shared oppression.
Fascinating to hear you talking about that and really sort of helping me understand art and its power in new ways. So absolutely not as this sort of piece of tool building that might help patch things together, but very much more dynamic and very much more transformative than that. art that builds better futures, that doesn't just help kind of end conflict, but really is much more revolutionary. And you mentioned this community building from below. Again, this is a theme that keeps coming up, this sense that it's resisting a kind of a top-down approach, a top-down sort of settlement and imposition of whether it's a peace or whether it's a ceasefire or whatever, but actually this sort of new community building from the ground up. We might come back and talk a little bit more about the impact which artists in Lebanon and Bosnia have been having. Lydia's already touched on this with, it's hard to measure the success, I suppose, or the impact a little bit. But I want to come to Teresa and ask a bit about your work, Teresa, in Colombia, about the kinds of conflict which people are struggling with there. And again, how community-based arts projects are helping to build different futures, pathways to peace and a different kind of community.
In the case of Colombia, Colombia's kind of endured violence for many, many decades, starting really in the 1940s and 50s, where there's this period of violence between the Conservative and the Liberal Party, which is simply known as la violencia, the violence. Then in the 60s, you start to see the emergence of the FARC, and along with that, you have right-wing militias. It's a real kind of cocktail of violence. Then in the case of Medellin, which is the city in Colombia which is part of this case study, violence really, really intensifies in the late 70s with the rise of drug cartels and continues on this kind of trajectory until the sort of 1990s, 1991. It gains the notorious title of being the most violent city in the world. The death of Pablo Escobar, you see then that there's a reduction in violence. Violence becomes more fractured. And so now, rather than having large kind of groups like the Medellin cartel, you see there are small groups. But the violence is quite complex. It's quite dynamic and fluid. So you have periods where you see the government colluding with drug cartels, but also with right-wing paramilitaries to drive out left-wing guerrillas in particular areas of the city. In terms of the case study in Medellin, I've been focusing primarily on hip hop. So it's quite interesting when Azadeh and Lydia were talking about artivism. And I'll just explain that hip hop is 4 elements. So it's comprised of MCing, so rapping, breakdancing, graffitiing, and DJing. But it's underpinned by a philosophy of nonviolence and social justice. So there's actually a hip hop declaration of peace, which is a UN-sponsored document. So you could argue that hip hop by its very nature, with it being rooted again in kind of the civil rights movement and the Black struggle in the United States, is innately political and is an innately activist art form. And it emerges in New York in the 1970s as a form of protest and a resistance to the increasing ghettoization of marginalized Black youth. But it's a phenomenon that's spread right across the globe. So you find localized examples of hip hop from Palestine to Nepal to Colombia to Manchester, the UK, all over the place. And it's often used by youth, particularly urban male youth, as a form of identity building, a means of kind of understanding, responding to social reality, and then a form of political protest. A lot of the time, formal channels of protest have been blocked for this group of young people. So in the case of Medellin, how do you protest against a drug cartel? It's about creating kind of alternative spaces, both for protest, but also then for kind of transformation and an alternative kind of space where you see that young people can be socialized into alternative norms and values. And if you think about the nature of violence in Colombia stemming from really the 1940s till present day, no one in Colombia has really known a period where there hasn't been violence. So it's about providing kind of a new space where people can be socialized into kind of non-violent norms and values, understanding coexistence, accepting difference. So hip hop is a really good way of engaging young people. And again, this is something that's quite interesting about the conflict in Medellin, is that young people are both victims and perpetrators of violence in general. So you might see the average age of a murder victim being sort of in their early 20s. But you can have, young people as sort of 10 being at risk of being recruited by gangs, which is where hip hop works, because on a kind of superficial level, it looks very much kind of like a cool kind of aesthetic form of popular culture. Underpinning that is this idea of a philosophy of nonviolence and these norms and values. There are alternative norms and values to a normalization of violence, which the city's experienced for many, many decades.
I mean, you've just sketched a really extraordinary history there of not just the sort of the length of time, but the complexity of all the different forms of violence that people have lived through. And this idea, it's awful to think about that it's very, very difficult for people to visualize a peace, because for generations, no one's lived with any kind of peace or respite from that. So do you think that the very specific, sounded from what you were saying, like the very specific kind of conflict, which is not perpetrated by, one state against another, but by drug cartels against another drug cartel, with government involvement and all sorts of, strange alliances and so on, is that one of the things that shapes the kind of creative practice that can flourish in that space?
I think so, but I think also it's a certain set of circumstances. So I think it's about the nature of the violence. It tends to be male urban youth in general as both victims and perpetrators. So then something like hip hop, again, thinking about localized versions of masculinity in that particular context. But in general, hip hop allows men to be men, shall we say, in a non-violent way. So you can see how hip hop can replicate expectations of what it means to be a man in that space. So if you take the example of breakdancing, you need to be physically strong, very muscular, very strong to be able to breakdance. If you win an MC battle, you gain status, potentially you earn money. So these, again, this challenge is what is seen in Medellin as a culture of easy money and status, which is joining gangs. So I think, again, graffiti, there's an element of danger and risk. Tagging, that's, tagging a building or having to, climb a building, or and then again, the status of having your tag or your artwork being recognized within a community. So I think, yes, the kind of nature of violence, as I said before, how do you protest? How do you negotiate kind of, violence with a drug cartel, or with actors that are operating outside of the rule of law, should we say, because it's not just drug cartels, it's also paramilitaries, it's also a corrupt state. So I think, kind of structural conditions, but then also thinking about cultural conditions as well, and ideas of maybe what it means to be a man in that context as well means that hip hop can work. Having said that, there is also a space for women in hip hop, but you tend to see that space is challenging what it means to be a woman in maybe in Medellin and those localized feminine versions of femininity. But you see that they have to kind of compete. So often it's kind of reproduced as quite a masculine version of femininity.
Yeah, so in some ways the art then is matching or meeting the very specific conditions of the conflict. Azadeh was talking about the conception of some of the art that she's been looking at in Lebanon as an extension of revolution, as a form of revolution, and very much in tune with wider political revolution. And here it sounds a bit like less revolution in a way. So I was just wondering if you could tease out a bit the relationship or the balance between self-preservation, identity building as an alternative to becoming part of a gang, and protest. It's hard to protest, but of course there's an element of protest in hip hop. What balance would you say there is here between protesting and self-preservation, or finding just an alternative route through this very difficult life?
I mean, I think they're one and the same. So I think the act of not being, a lot of people say, I don't do hip hop, I am hip hop. So it's that idea of becoming a hip hop artist and subscribing to an alternative viewpoint, subscribing to a life of non-violence. That is a protest in itself. If you think that young people are at risk of joining a gang and then emulating this kind of culture of violence, and this is the norm, then it's about breaking that norm. And breaking that norm is by actually not being involved in a gang and creating alternatives. And they talk a lot about a dignified life or alternative options for life, or developing projects for life. So it's really a kind of code and a way of living. So I think that is the protest, because that's the only way really you can protest, I think. And I think it's the most effective. So it's about how we can reduce violence and how we can prevent violence. That is a protest, and how we can create alternatives so that it's better for the next generation. And you see this kind of idea of community and family. So you'll have 30 or 40-year-old, 50-year-old hip hop artists, and they're teaching children as young as 4 to spin on their head. And again, that's that beauty. It's a political movement. But how do you talk to a child about peace building? What does that look like? It's about putting them into a space, a non-violent space, and teaching them about coexistence, and teaching them about accepting difference and finding non-violent solutions to problems.
Absolutely. You said helping next generations to absorb this alternative approach and so on. We've been looking at this for a number of years. What impact do you see it having, and who as well is noticing? Is the impact still relatively local? Is the impact something which in fact politicians are picking up on? Is this something that people are trying to transfer to other areas, other places, as a successful alternative, as a successful form of artivism?
So I think in terms of impact, there's a couple of things. So one is around kind of the status of young people, particularly young men from this particular part of the city. So the poorer areas of the city were kind of labelled as the breeding grounds of hitmen. And so these young people were stigmatised, they were marginalised because of where they were from. And now you see they have a certain status. So in kind of local and national press, they're constantly referred to as, cultural leaders, as peacemakers. They're kind of local celebrities. Obviously, there's not everybody who's gained the status, but certain members of hip hop organizations have, and artists have certain privileges. So again, in parts of Medellin, there are what are known as invisible borders, which means these are areas that are controlled by different gangs. And if you cross these kind of territorial markers, you can be killed. So there's been instances, terrible situations where, children have wandered down the wrong street and they've been murdered. So, I mean, it's a serious thing. Artists have the privilege of being able to move between these different spaces. So they have, even with gangs, they've earned a certain status. With politicians, you can very much see at a local level how the hip hop movement has kind of been incorporated, and I think even inspired as part of a wider civic movement that comes to fruition in the 90s, when there's this heightened violence, youth violence, where they start to, you see religious leaders and education institutions and NGOs come together. And there's a lot of youth NGOs working to try and reduce violence and prevent violence. And you see that some of the members of these NGOs became politicians in the 2000s, and they very much support these hip hop kind of initiatives. So through kind of funding and grants, but also by inviting them to talk about policy decisions. There was an incident where some graffiti was erased, and the local artists were invited by the mayor's office to talk about it, and they reached an agreement and they'd have designated graffiti areas. So it kind of shows you the currency they have in formal political spaces. Internationally, they've gained quite a lot of kind of recognition. Again, only particular groups, not everybody. So there may be articles that have been written about them in The Guardian or the New York Times. They've also been invited to talk at TED conferences in Latin America or in Europe about their work. So they have gained quite a lot of kind of recognition, which has been really, really important for the area. One of them said, because there is also a graffiti tour. So this is, again, how transformation has happened in terms of sort of economic impact, but also challenging this negative stereotype of a particular area and enabling people to sort of see a different side of this area. So it's been known now as kind of like a centre for urban arts. It's gone from being the most violent, the most visited barrio in Medellin, which is very significant for quite a marginalised area. In terms of the impact of this, so there's always a flip side, and I think we're in danger of maybe over-promising sometimes on what art can do and not thinking about maybe the wider structural and political conditions in which artists operate. So, for example, the graffiti tour is hugely successful, providing income for 40 directly to 40 families, providing income for kind of satellite businesses, but organisations have to pay illegal taxes and protection money to gangs. When they set up the tour, it created a turf war. So I think about 30 people were murdered in a turf war, because obviously now this is a very lucrative part of town for gangs. So I think the art can be limited by, the absence of rule of law, absence of, kind of continuing poverty and kind of structural inequalities. There are continued blocked sort of opportunities for social mobility. So as I said, not all artists are enjoying the same kind of economic or social status. And it's quite interesting that the ones who appear to have been doing very well, or had a kind of a pathway facilitated for them, are the ones that operated in an area that was subject to a military intervention by the Colombian government in the early 2000s. So, if you want to sort of take a cynical approach, you could say that they were kind of swept up in a wider kind of strategy of hearts and minds and trying to legitimize and create stability as the state tries to repair relations with this particular community.
Really interesting there. So the conditions can still be very complex, but what you've just said there about some of the art being leveraged and absorbed does show its power and the importance of its message. Even if it's taken over, it's clear that some of the things that art is saying and doing is reaching a wider audience and saying things that people feel that they're having to listen to and having at least to pay lip service to, if nothing else. And all of that, I suppose, slowly, gradually changes the discourse on the conflict, and that in turn might lead to changing the nature of the conflict itself. Lydia, I wonder if we can come back to you. So, we've been talking a little bit about the impact which creative activities and art-based interventions can have, not just in short-term responses to a major crisis, but actually potentially in very long-term peace building. I mean, I think what Teresa's just been sketching there is something that's sort of gradually happening over a very long period of time. How widely recognised is this approach, is an arts-based approach to long-term grassroots peace building within academic and political circles? I know you yourself have been trying to promote more creative and participatory methods in the field of international relations, for example, actually doing publications which are really focused on creative practice rather than just academic study. Has that been an uphill struggle? Is it starting to take off? Is this something that academia and political circles are increasingly receptive to?
Yeah, sure. So kind of just thinking around this idea of art as a process. I mean, I think for both artists themselves, but also academics who work in art history or art practice, I think the process of art is often the art itself. I think that's quite an accepted way of working. So art is not really about the product. Its transformative impact is really in its doing, in its making, and in the connections that it builds. I think this is maybe something that, at least in my own field of international relations, scholars maybe struggle more with this because it's not very easy to measure a process. How is that quantifiable? What impact does it have? I think these are messy ways of tracing impact and kind of talking about the stories, talking about the visuals, talking about the different connections, talking about relationships. I think it's recognized in certain parts of IR. So I know in a lot of visual security studies, for example, would definitely be accepted. And there's lots of scholars working on making in all sorts of contexts. So for example, soldiers engaging in textile activities, for example, as a way of knowing war, or own work on needlework and curating through the Conflict Textiles Archive as a way that we can know war and conflict. I'm not sure whether I would describe it as an uphill struggle. I think it's more just that it's accepted in some ways and blocked in others. So I think people are kind of excited and they're often interested in the role of the arts because it's visually interesting to look at. It clearly does tell us something about politics and international politics. I think the challenges come more in terms of how we talk about that in academic ways. So there's challenges to publishing in more high-level academic journals. There's often extra hoops that we have to go through to kind of make this knowledge within international relations, even to the extent we kind of publish theoretical articles first to kind of say, well, this is a way that we can know it. But I think it also brings opportunities as well. I mean, I know from kind of interaction with the Visualising War network at St Andrews that it creates a lot of space for interdisciplinarity and different conversations between academics who are interested in art and its impact on war and peace. So I think there's different opportunities, but also challenges.
Yes, that sounds very likely. So I suppose academia will always struggle a little bit with the fact that it's got to be evidence-based, there has to be proof, and as you've sketched, it's very, very difficult sometimes to provide tangible proof of the impact which, let's say, a soldier working with needlework might find in getting to know war better, or getting to understand aspects of war differently, let's say. So academia, I suppose, will always struggle with the sort of intangibility, the unmeasurability of some of that. But as you mentioned, Lydia, I think there is a lot more interest in studying different ways of visualizing humanitarian crises. There's a fantastic research project that Roland Bleicher has recently got funding for on that front, and an understanding that all sorts of art forms have a role to play in visualizing in terms of creating, not just looking at future situations.
Yeah, so in terms of weaving arts-based interventions within academic work, this is something that Laura Mills and I have actively been working on. So we recently founded a special section within CVIR, Contemporary Voices, the St Andrews Journal of International Relations. The section's called Openings, and what it aims to do is create space for different kinds of artistic scholarship, poetry, autoethnography, photo essays, really anything you can imagine, it's in there. And our forthcoming issue is a special issue that actually builds from the Threads, War and Conflict exhibition that was at St Andrews in 2019. So it's got some interventions from students and staff who are part of the exhibition, as well as other creative interventions that kind of connect to the themes of the exhibition, themes of displacement, loss, political violence, gender and war that were contained within the textiles. So hopefully that should be coming out this autumn. So do watch out for it.
That's very exciting to hear about a different approach really making itself felt in international relations publishing. Azadeh, I wonder if you can come in here. The creative arts have always been a way of processing conflict. For centuries and centuries and centuries, art in many different forms has reflected on conflict and has established some really canonical ways of visualizing it, heroizing certain kinds of people involved in conflict, sometimes questioning aspects of conflict too. But the Art of Peace project is really interested in harnessing the potential of the arts in much more interventionist ways to disrupt established ideas about, let's say, the inevitability of conflict and to build social movements that resist and rebuild. So how optimistic are you about the impact which this can have over the next few decades in different parts of the world? If you were looking into a crystal ball, what do you see in the future in terms of the role that arts can play? And what do you think that we need to invest in to support that and make it happen?
I think arts have the capacity to provide us with alternative ways of seeing and visualizing war. When we look at artistic production during this last decade in Lebanon and Syria, we realize this creative momentum deserves a critical reflection. In Lebanon, artists have created a work that transcends sectarian, national, and regional borders. This work has cultivated reconciliation, community responsibility, and solidarity in a trans-local national level. Another way that art can contribute is when you, for example, you look at the narrative on the Syrian events, often tends to simplify what is actually very complex and varied reality on the ground. In this multifaceted context, the arts have functioned as an alternative lens through which we can understand the multi-layered experience of diverse communities. Then also you have the way artistic initiatives have visualized these human consequences of war in Syria, which is often absent in the official narratives. And these human consequences of war is very important, the way it has been represented in artistic mediums, because it complicates the official representations of suffering and victimhood. In other way, we have the artists who are speaking about victims without victimizing them. For me, the question is how the art is giving agency to the subjects it's representing, it's portraying. And when you look at the work of artists, you see that the art is not only a site for creative expression, but also a way for them to renegotiate the terms of their political lives in small ways, as Richmond says. So I believe in an optimistic way that artists represent war in imaginative and creative ways. And I share Roland Bleicher's view that the work of art can lead us to see the world in a new light and rethink assumptions we have taken for granted. It can help us imagine the unimaginable.
That's a fantastic idea to hold on to there, Azadeh. And, you've pointed out several times the way in which art disrupts, but helps us revisualize, recategorize, break out of our traditional ways of thinking, our binary thinking quite often, the ideas and the assumptions that we've inherited. What you said just then about representing and speaking about victims without re-victimizing them, giving them agency. Art at its best empowers as well as helps us revisualize. So it's really exciting to hear you talking in such an optimistic way about that. Of course, not all art is going to do that. Some art will continue to confirm traditional assumptions and conform to sort of past prejudices and so on. But I think, you've really given us some insight into how disruptive and creative and regenerative different art forms can be. Teresa, can we come to you just as a sort of final reflection? We've heard a bit about where the Art of Peace project is going, what that's uncovered, what it's trying to do in terms of perhaps establishing some different academic approaches or helping support different academic approaches that incorporate an understanding of creative practice and creative arts. But it'd be great to know a little bit more about what you think the NGO, the charity In Place of War, will be doing in future. What are your future plans and hopes there?
Sure. So we've got a couple of things that I guess are related really to what I was talking about earlier about decolonializing knowledge and celebrating local knowledge production. So we're working on a project at the moment called 100 Agents of Change, which is about promoting the use of art to drive positive social transformation with young people, in England. So we're working with 10 youth organisations. So these are young people from diverse backgrounds, some are refugee backgrounds, and working in kind of underserved communities. So places where there isn't a lot of art, should we say, or maybe a lot of social mobilisation or civic participation. So places like Barrow-in-Furness, places like Telford in Shropshire. So maybe not the obvious places, the kind of youth activism or art. And the idea is that they will learn from our network of young people who are based in sites of conflict who are using art to create alternatives. So it's about sharing knowledge, skills and experience. The young people will then receive a mentor and some funding to help them set up their project. So it's kind of a legacy, I guess, of the Art of Peace to some degree. And we're also working as Art of Peace, or as some kind of non-academic outputs that we've been working on. So one of them is a living museum. So this is enabling, in times of COVID in particular, enabling artists from the case studies to be able to showcase their work using 3D cameras. So again, they're going to create the content. We're going to provide them with cameras and training in the use of cameras, and also in the kind of use of training in curation and storytelling. And then they're going to document their practice, their neighborhoods, an exhibition, whatever they want to kind of document that talks about their work. This will all be uploaded onto the In Place of War website, and so this will be part of the legacy of the project. A final thing that we're also working on as part of the Art of Peace project is looking at alternative forms of evaluation and impact. So again, trying to understand, what the outcomes are of these projects. And this is something that not only kind of we've struggled with from an academic theoretical perspective, but it's something that people on the ground also struggle to maybe understand or articulate. So been working with partners from the In Place of War network in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in Colombia to look at kind of alternative ways of how you might measure. So there's some really interesting arts-based evaluation methods. There's also some social metrics which are based on indigenous culture from Colombia. So this idea of well-being and living well, rather than donors thinking about kind of funding of arts-based peace projects tend to look at economics or tend to look very much at qualitative data. So it's about looking at alternatives that might be more relevant in kind of global South contexts.
That sounds like an incredibly valuable piece of work there, which hopefully will then give the grassroots arts projects that are happening all around the world even more traction, as you say, if you are able to communicate, or if they are able to communicate to the kinds of people who might fund them or who might take them seriously, then of course they will then be taken more seriously in turn. And I love the idea of the video documenting. I suppose it touches on something that I know Azadeh cares very much about, the idea that art travels, and that by traveling it works a whole power of good all around the world, this sort of itinerant art. So that's really interesting to hear about. And I should say to listeners that you can find more out about In Place of War by visiting their website, www.inplaceofwar.net. And you can also look at the Art of Peace Research Project website on the University of Manchester's website. So Lydia, Teresa, Azadeh, it's been so interesting talking to you and learning so much about the very different kinds of grassroots art activism, artivism that's going on in all sorts of places of conflict, and the difference that they're making to all sorts of different people's lives, and the way in which they're articulating that diversity of experience of conflict, and not simply building pathways to peace, but potentially revolutionizing communities in the process and building better futures. So thank you so much to all of you for coming on the podcast and sharing those really inspiring stories with us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope that you found this conversation as fascinating as I have. Do keep tuning in to the Visualising War podcast. We're going to be taking a short break over Christmas, but we'll be back in the new year, and we'll be continuing to look at different artistic representations and responses to conflict in our next episode. My guest will be award-winning artist Catherine Brimblecombe-Fox, who uses art to question and critique the role played by modern technology in current and future warfare. So we'll be looking at some art of a very different type from what we've been talking about today. But like the Art of Peace project, it will get us thinking about art as a form of positive, critical, and even radical intervention. So please do join us in the new year if you can. If you would like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafia Gertin. Thank you for listening, and have a very Merry Christmas.